Okay, thanks for coming. I'm very, very happy to introduce Shannon Jackson to this lecture series, which this semester consists only of one lecture, this one here. Shannon is, I copied some stuff from the website because I found the way she phrases research interests so interesting. She is Cyrus and Michelle Hadidi Professor of the Arts and Humanities, and she is the Department Chair of History of Art at the University of California in Berkeley. And she leads the Environmental Arts and Humanities Initiative for the UC Berkeley. And she writes here, her research focuses on two overlapping domains. First, collaborations across visual, performing, and media art forms, and second, the role of the arts in social institutions and in social change. And it's actually both of these things that attracted me to her work years ago. And what I find particularly interesting is that she has a background in theater, but also works in art history. So there's an understanding of two different artistic fields and their inner logics, and she's been paying a lot of attention in her research to the intersections and interferences and frictions between these two different fields. And I think it's an interesting and very appropriate topic when it comes to performance in general, but also when it comes to questions of the interaction of music with other fields, like music with visual art, music and performance. And she has won a lot of prizes with her work and has a lot of different positions and different institutions. One of them is a neighboring one, it's at ZKM, she's on the board there. And I'm going to mention only three of her publications, 3 books. The first one is from 2004, Professing Performance, Theater in the Academy from Philology to Performativity. That's still very much in the theater tradition. And then comes Social Works, Performing Art, Supporting Publics, which is exactly about the intersection and the misunderstandings and everything between visual art and theater. And the last one is a collection of essays. It's called Backstages, Essays Across Art, Performance, and the Social from 2022. And I'm very happy that you're here, Shannon. The floor is yours.
Thank you. All right. Thank you so much, Christian, for inviting me, and thank you all for spending your evening with us, Wednesday evening, especially at a school where there's so much else going on, so very much appreciated. So, the way we perform now, what might that mean? The way we perform in the new now, what might that mean? Does it mean the same thing? As Christian knows, over the last decade, I've been grouping thoughts under these questions and grappling with, as he said, a range of live performing arts experiments within visual art worlds, in galleries, museums, biennials, where the time-based and embodied nature of live performance sometimes seem to be all the rage, especially in the last decade or so. Where rage sometimes means excited celebration, and sometimes it means angry lamentation, depending on your point of view. But where we were in, I would say, 2010 is part of what I'm thinking about exploring, and then where we ended up over the last several years in terms of all of this experimentation. I'm reworking some thoughts that I've been doing over the last decade in response to the invitation today. So what I'll do is very quickly review some of the moves of the second decade of the 21st century, where some of these interferences that Christian described started to unfold. Say, in the fall of 2011, when Rosalie Goldberg declared Performa, normally a biennial of performance art, declared it to be a biennial devoted to the question of theater in the visual art landscape, even though she said at the time, "I hate theater," like Marina says. That challenge intersected with other challenges coordinated by experimental performance festivals, like Under the Radar in the United States, which included a symposia that included Rosalie on the black box versus the white cube. In the spring of 2012, Jay Saunders and Elizabeth Sussman at the Whitney became celebrated in part for the number of performances they curated inside of it. With Wu Song was there, Michael Clark was in there, Richard Maxwell, theater director Richard Maxwell, and some of you may know Sarah Mitchelson won the Buxbaum Prize, the Whitney Prize, and as such was the first trained choreographer to win the Central Prize of the Whitney Biennial. By fall of 2012, MoMA was commissioning all varieties of performances, from the maybe parodic, maybe activist, maybe earnest events of grand openings, to the citing not simply of movement in the gallery, but citing trained choreographers, chosen, for instance, by Ralph Lemon himself, a trained choreographer, who made dancers with other trained choreographers on subjects that engaged the fundamentals of dance history. Meanwhile, so this is the New York rap, a sampling, but there was a lot of other non-New York-based activity that were considering these cross-art stakes, including, say, compatriots at the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis that were trying to think about what it meant to collect the costumes of Merce Cunningham, or in Los Angeles, Marina Abramovic, her performance installation at a donor event in Mocha. At Mocha, hired dancers, most often dancers, were used to create these very eerie experiential sculptures and sentient centerpieces that were critiqued at the time as capitulations to the museum's experience economy. In the United Kingdom, exactly that same year, Tate Modern opened its tanks, aside from Turbine Hall, the tanks down lower. That was a new commitment of permanent space to the presentation of temporary art forms, including, to start it off, social practice artist Suzanne Lacey was paired with choreographer Anna Teresa de Kiersmacher. Both of those are examples of projects that were not objects, you could say, whether it was a socially engaged art object or a choreographic work. So admittedly, around this time, I was grappling with a lot of live performing arts forms that were coded as dance, sometimes theater, noting a differentiation that many of these works were not coded as performance art, which had already had its own intervention in the museum. And as Christian anticipated, part of what I was thinking about was this kind of cross-arts engagement that particularly had a social dimension in a first book published in 2011, Social Works, and then subsequently over the last several years have been responding to more and more experiments and challenges that have now been collected more recently in this more recent book, Backstages. So, as Christian said, he has challenged me to think again about an essay that has been republished in Backstages, The Way We Perform Now, thinking about what it might be to perform in the new now, but more specifically to think about how forms coded as music might fit into these equations, if they fit, or if they turn the equations on their heads. As you'll see as I continue, there is something equation-like about this kind of thinking. It means that you often are thinking through inherited categories from one art form and think about how they square, or whether there's a parallel with categories in a different art form. It means sort of navigating these puzzles around mediums and different histories, what often really feels like a puzzle, like a Tetris-like puzzle amongst discourses and disciplines in which I personally have variable expertise, and I consider music to be a place where I have much less expertise. But I accepted Christian's invitation so that I could challenge myself to think through from a new angle, and also so I could think with you about it as well, about what we think we might be doing now in relation to what we thought we were doing then. So, to set the scene or reset the scene, I'll start by breaking down the words of my title, The Way We Perform in the New Now. So to begin with, I'll think about these words, and then I'm going to go, in the second part of my talk, think about a set of occupational hazards and queries that come up along the way. So to begin, in the field of transdisciplinary practice, the way invokes larger questions about medium, technique, and skill as they interface with different sensory modalities of image, sound, materiality, along with different conceptions, you could say, of virtuosity, amateurism, pleasure, rigor, or, after Christian, different conceptions of openness and sophistication that might inhere in the reception of an art form. These various ways of making art and culture also interact with different conceptions, I could say, of what we think the way used to be. Did the way used to mean, for some of you, some of us, some elsewhere outside of this building, the making of material objects in a studio? Or was the way the making of dance in a different kind of studio? Did the way used to mean creating marketable art for the collector class exhibited in galleries, or was it the selling of tickets for a subscriber class? Did the way used to mean displaying art on a wall in the dedicated space of the museum, or did the way used to mean performing an instrument in the dedicated space of the concert hall? Those different notions about what the way might be obviously expose different notions of who the we might be, based on who we think the we was, and whether you ever thought you were part of it. So now, again, thinking about transdisciplinary practice, where many art forms might come together, is the we who assembles former art students from those studios, skilled in objects of paint, concrete, woodworking, metal, and occasionally venturing into experimental performance? Or was the we former theater students, people for whom performance means learning scansion, memorizing blocking, developing emotion memory, learning about your character, accessing the diaphragm to project a voice? Is it that kind of we who's assembling into the performance place? Or was it former dancers whose limbs perch atop bars and before mirrors, producing feats of virtuosic excellence while keeping pace with musical timing and rhythm? Is the we former music students, those who practiced on instruments of wood or metal, sometimes also former music students or current music students who access a diaphragm, albeit for a different kind of vocalization? Perhaps the we is a set of people who manage the careers of all of these we's, the gallerists who sell the objects, or the museum curators who display them, maybe the performance curators who commission a work, or the performance season planner who books it in a ticketed season, the agent who supports the artist, the gallerist who supports the artist. Finally, the we also captures the receivers of performance in the new now, the one who thought of herself, say, as a beholder in one venue and an audience member in another venue, the one who sat in rows in the theater, like you are now, or the one who roamed the museum in 4-second intervals, stopping at each work as they make it through gallery to gallery. Now, in a kind of fused situation where receptive practices change, the we is potentially finding a different way to be a receiver or an audience member, somebody who struggles to figure out the conceptual and even physiological terms of engagement, say propping her back against a wall or muscling toward the one remaining bench in the gallery, struggling to catch a note or tone only barely audible with the poor acoustics of the museum, or struggling to try to catch an image of a dancer with the poor sightlines of the gallery. So what is it to be a receiver in this hybrid practice, in a space that is not a dedicated concert hall space? In addition to that physiological confusion of being a receiver to hybrid performance, these various we's endure, you could say, conceptual confusion. What art literacies and receptive habits now seem to need complete recalibration with every newly encountered work? So, by now, you might have a sense that it becomes exceedingly hard to make complete and firm sense of what this word perform might mean in my title, performing or performance, and what it means to structure our experience or lack of experience with these various ways and these various ways of being a we. That goes double for the phrase perform now, which sounds so menacingly familiar as a directive. In English, it's often a command to keep pace, to be that you're fending off evaluation, perform now, perform or else after John Mackenzie. And that menace or confusion triples with that new now, perform in the new now. One that maybe reflects avant-garde compulsions or neo-avant-garde compulsions to be more avant than the previous avant-garde was. It chimes with the varied and sometimes parodic use of that word contemporary. What is contemporary? What is the new contemporary? Or as Christian and Douglas Barrett have both resonantly argued, sometimes via Peter Osborne, the word contemporary reflects maybe more an aesthetic judgment, maybe an aesthetic vibe, more than it does anything like a stable chronological marker. In the spirit of Richard Meyer, we might not be asking what is contemporary, but what was contemporary. Or whatever that contemporary spirit was, it needs, predictably, to be replaced with the spirit of a new now, a new contemporary. So indeed, a decade ago, when we were all, many of us, curators and artists and critics trying to make sense of this flurry of activity that I quickly ran past you, we were often actually talking about spirits, specifically the new spirit of capitalism and its post-Fordist manifestations. We were thinking about post-operational philosophy quite a bit then, and other post-industrial thinking that tracked capitalism's moves from the production of material commodities toward the production of so-called immaterial services. The performative museum was dubbed, reductively, a symptom of the broader, spirited late capitalist turn to service, to the ephemerality, immateriality of service. I understood that sociological assessment of the situation, and sometimes I agreed with it, but sometimes I was annoyed by it. In many ways, the diagnosis seemed to be crafted, I'd say, by a particular we, by an art world, a visual art world we, who was used to a particular way. Immateriality was a relational coding, one placed as the opposite of a certain kind of materialized art making. But for those of us raised in live performing arts, the turn to performance didn't necessarily feel like a turn, or at least not a turn in the same way. We'd already been selling services, more than objects, for 2,000 years, and frankly, we didn't necessarily think of our services as immaterial. Those limbs, remember those limbs, the diaphragms, the instruments, the dedicated concert hall spaces, what isn't material about these services. But that was a way, a part of a circulation of the then now, the then new now. And I know that in some ways, I'm not sure if this kind of discourse that was a very, very big part of the teens, I would say, is necessarily the same discourse that we're turning to, nor does it seem like the same kind of frenzy that this experimentation felt like, I would say, in the early aughts, the early teens. Late capitalism is still quite frenzied, but the critique that might be more relevant might be one that has to do with the Americanization of socioeconomic models right now, the dismantling of public sector systems, and the appropriation of the cultural sector for autocratic ends. We'll say if there's a critique around the economics of culture at the moment, this seems all too current for me, at least right now, and of course that would be a different talk, but needed to mention it. Of course, another factor that has changed for me now, just even speaking today, is the challenge of factoring music more deeply and also anticipating the civic platform, a very ambitious civic platform that many of us will have a chance to encounter in Nuremberg. So in recalling this frenzy of 2011, 2012, 2014, I find myself asking where music was in the mix. It was definitely there. Here's another MoMA moment in 2011. It was there as a sensory mode, sometimes as an ambiance-making technique, sometimes as a defamiliarizing technique. Sometimes it found itself defamiliarized in a quasi-sculptural or social form. But were cutting-edge musical practitioners in the mix, and music curators and music scholars? Did they want to be in the mix? So at this point, with me asking that question, and you might ask yourselves, I'll turn to a scene-setting meditation sort of toward a more collective reflection then about some of these questions, asking some questions about occupational hazards and things that are true questions for me about what it is to cross amid this inter-art space and to factor music as we do. So I'm going to recall several of my top queries from a decade of reflection and add some new ones for today based on my sense of the music factor. Herewith then, I'll say my top 10 queries about music and the new now. We'll see how they go. So to proceed, first, just putting out there the ways in which disciplinary barometers affect our encounters with so-called interdisciplinary art forms. When I first began making this argument, I used to say, medium-specific histories affect our encounters with unmedium-specific work. But then theater and dance people asked me what medium specificity meant, which is to say I had unwittingly made my own point. Even if we all claim to be interested in, say, a cross-arts experiment, the forms that we've experienced, the ways we know, will affect how we gauge the innovation of that cross-art experiment. Even the brilliant cross-art experiences of William Kentridge. If you measure its distance from sculpture versus measure its distance from cinema and video versus measure its distance from music, different things will come to the fore as you bring your disciplinary barometer to the occasion. It also will affect what you think is new, and what you think is old, what you think is an innovation, and what you think is tradition. More on that soon. When it comes to music, just a side note then about music, let me invoke a medium-specific issue that I know less well, but I began thinking about more for this occasion, and that is how the tradition, say, of absolute music in the 20th century factored into the equation of contemporary arts experiment. As both Douglas Barrett and Christian have detailed, the legacy of this frame around the purity, or you could say the internally complete circuit of absolute music, is routed, of course, through prior histories, but was reinforced by modernist critics, modernist ones as well. Here, this is one of many I could have chosen from Christian's work. Seth Kim Cohen, he's quoting, seems to suggest that we actually have to unlearn to listen in order to escape a discourse on music that is irredeemably contaminated by the idea of absolute music and medium specificity. It is hardly thinkable that any contemporary theorist of visual art would propose a strong concept of seeing as the opticality in that pure medium specific sense. The fact that the situation is fundamentally different in music has a lot to do with the persistence of absolute music. So that influence of that legacy arguably acts as a bulwark against the kind of hybrid, cross-disciplinary, unmedium specific practices that we might be describing. Or to answer my own question, was music scholars, top music composers in this mix? Music might not always have been in the mix of what I was describing because the legacy of absolute music did not want any mixing. You could think about it and challenge me, and more than that. Even in my invocation of medium specificity or unspecificity, or my opposition between, say, the visual art world and the live performing arts world, I'm setting up, I need to say now, a kind of polarized frame that I also need to challenge if we're to understand mixture, because, second, binaries, reductive binaries will produce blind spots. This happens when we find ourselves in gatherings that try to think about, as we're doing now, the relationship between visual arts and performance, and realize that there is tremendous heterogeneity reduced in this opposition. In the mid-aughts, for instance, dance enjoyed a special kind of incorporation in the visual art world. I'll say that theater did not, and arguably that music did not. We cannot begin to notice that difference without noticing that there have been historic tussles and tangles amongst live performing arts forms, amongst dance and theater and music that don't think of themselves as the same, right? To state the obvious, it's right under our nose, music differs from those other historic live performing arts forms because of its presumably, we could partially say, non-optical or less optical or nature. We watch dance and theater with our eyes. We supposedly listen to music, where listening, as Christian has described in the Discourse of Absolute Music, is often prescribed as something one does best with one's eyes closed. Similarly, visual art is a very baggy and largely unhelpful term to stand in for an enormous variety of practices. Painting will connect the dots to the action of performance much differently than sculpture does. Photography's relationship is different still. So think then too about the binary around this notion of the venue, of the black box versus the white cube. Another binary that sets up a visual art and theatrical trajectories, but this opposition will keep us from noticing, for instance, that the history of the white cube is a very specific history within a much longer, not always white, history of museum display. It's different from salon display, for instance. The white cube is a relatively early invention. The polarization also notices that the black box is a form of theatrical space that reacted against the theatrical proscenium. The black box is not equivalent to theater, much less to live performing arts, but it's a variant of theatrical experimentation. And of course, this opposition, black box, white cube, will not notice the different associations that come up if the black box is a cinematic black box. It also, for my church today, won't notice the opposition that might come, the relation and heterogeneity that might come up when we factor the different specifications of the concert hall as a venue for live performing arts, or even this one as well, that has a certain kind of audio infrastructure that not every live performing arts space would have. So binaries can be helpful for thinking through cross-arts experiment, but they always invite another round of reflection and recombination. Every binary implies an equation that needs to be challenged. And in the landscape of this cross-arts experiment, there's a great deal of adventurous recombining, but there can also be some clueless recombining. Clueless, does that translate in English? Some confused combining. Indeed, to turn to a new query in this landscape, the deconstruction of one form often involves the reconstruction of another form. We begin to notice this dynamic when we compare a work in relation to one artistic barometer and then think about what it means if we look at it from another artistic barometer. In so many of the examples of the way we performed, say around 2012, 13, 14, I found myself compelled and frustrated by this axiom. So many efforts to deconstruct a visual art form from the object status of painting or sculpture employed something like performance. The fact that performance was so relevant for doing this breaking was exciting, But the actual history of the performing arts as such was partly about tradition and continuity as much as it was about disrupting and dismantling. So what do we make then just generally of a landscape where one form, here an institutional critique practice that is disrupting the museum as a kind of form in the visual arts, is making use of another tradition, say the tradition of acting? What do we make of that? What do we make also of the fact that very few people seem to notice or think about or care about that appropriation or reuse? To get even snarkier about it, what to make of the fact that innovation to some can look like a reinvented wheel to others? It can be risky to use an example here. And extra risky for me as an amateur in music who might reinvent a wheel herself. But I'll elaborate on the conundrum and let you ponder. So this is an extension of point number 3, but an opportunity to elaborate on different kinds of reinvention. One variant might occur simply through a process of recontextualization. The same form, let's say a musical form, is received as extra exciting, extra groundbreaking, extra compelling, simply by being located in an unusual space. So, for instance, when Theaster Gates brings the Black Monks of Mississippi to Documenta, the recontextualization is received as an aesthetic move. And arguably here, it's also received as a social move, actually a social move within a social practice. Whether or not all versions of this move have socio-political relevance, the relocation, say, of a familiar musical form inside of a gallery space or an expanded visual art installation space feels like a move to some, feels like innovation to some, and might feel all too familiar and not particularly innovative to others. In tracking the installation of dance and music in galleries, in museums, in biennial pavilions, we could also say that in the German biennial pavilion, maybe even in the Lithuanian sand-filled biennial pavilion, we might find this dynamic operating. The presence of a dancing body, the presence of an operatic voice, both can be received as particularly spectacular, particularly resonant, because they've been located outside of dance's concert stage, outside of music's concert hall. So, those are just a few examples after all. Really more about receptive habits, not about the strength of the work, but I'll come back to that later. I'm sure you can provide better examples. I'd love to hear them. But when we do think about the strength of a work, what makes something good, or what makes some of us decide to render judgment favorably while others might decide it's kind of weak, I wonder if within contemporary music art studies you ever find yourself grappling with a dynamic that some of us did, especially in dance and theater at the time. Or where, as David Levine and Andy Horowitz, both performance critics, noted that bad theater, what looks to us like kind of bad theater, ends up being received as good art. Or the opposite, kind of good theater, good virtuosic theater is received as bad art from a different vantage point. So as you think about those questions and think about goodness and badness as applied to music or innovation or repurposed tradition, I'll invoke a fifth query around music's place within cross-experimental contexts. So what is the role of skill, you could say, in these hybrid contexts? What is the role of something like virtuosity? And what kind of virtuosity do we mean? Indeed, what happens when virtuosity as a kind of technical skill meets virtuosity as a kind of conceptual skill? So, I just created a new binary, I realize. At the same time, it really seems to me that some of the tussles around this relationship, around what's tradition, what's innovation, around what feels like good, and what feels rudimentary, have to do with differently positioned receivers in art worlds, different we's, who might find the same work compelling from one angle and uninteresting from another, provocative from one angle and sort of like the emperor's new clothes from another angle. While they use different labels, we could say all varieties of 20th and 21st century art forms have had their conversations about what might be called a conceptual turn. That said, each of us might have different, deeper, more sophisticated understandings of how that turn manifested in our own art genealogies than we do other art genealogies. To be brief but reductive, in many art fields, part of how I end up teaching it is I often say that the conceptual art orientation focused on decentering, you could say, the execution of identifiable skill in the lay sense of the term. That is, skill that might lie in the stroke of a paintbrush, or in the height of a leap or a jump, or in hitting a melodic note, in order to focus on the exploration of an idea. In its simplest form, this is when art puts itself in quotation marks, provoking, I could say, a less cynical reading, a critical form of reflection on the parameters and definition of art itself. Along the way, the focus on idea, you could say, sidelined the appeal and pleasure of virtuosic skill, again, in the lay sense of the term, in order to focus on that conceptual sense, virtuosity of the conceptual. We have shorthands in these different art fields for isolating this move across arts contexts, focusing on the idea of the art object, the idea of movement, the idea of sound. We'll invoke, for instance, Duchamp's latrine in order to isolate the conceptual move in a visual arts genealogy. We'll invoke Yvonne Rayner's Trio A to invoke a conceptual turn in a dance genealogy. And of course, we'll invoke John Cage's 433 to isolate that conceptual turn in a musical genealogy. Even if we have these shorthands, and even if people of different art worlds know those shorthands, arguably they only go so far or deep enough in order to set up enough critical framing for understanding the deep, complex, and varied nature of a range of hybrid art forms. Without a more solid immersion in a multi-arts trajectory of conceptual practice in conceptual art or minimalist dance or post-dramatic theater or what Douglas Barrett has called musical contemporary art, we might have different ways of deciding where the idea even is, much less where the skill is, or whether we even track the idea, or see the skill. We also might have different tolerance levels for the sometimes unpleasurable nature of less familiar forms of artistic experiment. Does the dance really have to be that boring? Does the music really have to be that assonant? Or that quiet? Or that silent? At these moments, some in the audience, some beholders might need reassurance that the experiment before us really is innovative, despite being underwhelming. That said, we might also still want to ask, is it ever the case that some artists hijack this de-skilling move? The history of de-skilling and conceptual art and performance occurred when artists trained in a variety of forms, you could say actively masked that skill or redirected the skill, marshaling a series of conceptual questions in order to interrogate and explore art traditions from whence they came. This actually can be very hard to do. It was hard for Jackson Pollock to do in painting. It was hard for Yvonne Rayner to do. As some of you may know, Trio A is actually very hard to perform. But I think we might breed distrust when we find those internal critiques of virtuosity in the lay sense used to celebrate work that might look to others as, I'll just say, look mediocre. The specific parameters of an artist's decisions to mask or self-de-skill assume that they had skills in the first place, a formulation that might seem odd or obvious until you think of the number of ways that critiques of virtuosity in one context might be hijacked to rationalize experimentation that doesn't seem to require skill in the first place. So, forgive me, I will not share an example here. But we can say that the reverse situation can also be a hazard. in a landscape where some might have different barometers and then tolerance levels for gauging virtuosity as concept or virtuosity as physically trained skill. New exposure to certain techniques or art experiments can look suspiciously virtuosic, like a capitulation to old traditions of art, of beauty, of good art. While unfamiliar conceptual forms can appear curiously unskilled, to other eyes, some forms look egregiously overskilled, too good, too beautiful, too compelling, too charismatically virtuosic in the lay sense of the term to have any conceptual value. Certainly, this notion of the suspiciously overskilled, or perhaps too pleasurable, overshadowed many of the performance experiments that I shared with you in the wider context from an earlier, prior now, especially dance performance, especially beautiful dance performance, however that was understood. Indeed, many a curator felt versions of this concern, and one curator told me at one point during Sarah Mitchelson's run at the Whitney Biennial that museum trustees liked it because beauty was being brought back into the museum gallery after so much conceptual art had disallowed it. So beauty, whoops. In a 21st century visual art context, that made it suspicious. If at the same time, there's an overriding question, because something is registered as beautiful to some or pleasurable to some, does that mean it can't make a critical intervention? With that asked, it occurs to me, and I'll query you, whether music carries the risk of this hazard in many forms and varieties. Again, I'm an amateur, but let me explore it as a question. Is it the case that music's beauty, or the affective sensoria that it activates, makes it risk this types of attribution in the cross arts experiment, as if music allows beauty to be snuck back into the museum? Perhaps it isn't beauty exactly, but could it be pleasure? Or, as Christian has also said, we often note that we're more likely to hear pop music mixed into contemporary art practice than we are likely to hear art music. Indeed, as he has argued, we barely hear art music in the art world. The mixing of pop music and contemporary art might look suspicious to many contemporary music critics. It's hardly sophisticated. Or, as Christian has also said, perhaps that judgment too quickly discounts the degree to which pop music might be doing something different and utilized for critical ends that might be in concert with a conceptual art move. Here, as he says, actually the most likely candidate for music that is conceptually interesting, socially aware, and works, I'm putting you on the spot today, in your place of employment, works with different media, could be pop music, all of those cool things that conceptual art, contemporary art are supposed to be. When visual artists draw on music or even play music, it's invariably pop. What they are drawn to is its accessibility, its ability to create something that might be called a social atmosphere, and finally, a type of conceptual intelligence that works within the culture industry. So it's a kind of immanent critique of the culture industry. In many ways, there are greater affinities between contemporary art and pop than between contemporary art and new music. That's a fun paradox. So, through this version of the talk, then, we might ask, well, perhaps the pleasure of pop can still be, a la Christian, a critical intervention. Depends on how you hear it and how you register the integrity of its move. So, throughout this version of the talk on the way we perform now, and now tuned to a new now, I have tried to ask myself different versions of the same questions that I asked 10 years ago about music in the visual art world. Basically, trying to ask, is the place of music in the visual art world writing the same paradoxes that other live performing art forms rode in relation to the visual art world? Is music to visual art the same as dance is to visual art? Throughout, I suppose, I almost have been saying yes or maybe, but let me hazard a couple more thoughts that might allow me to say no, it's not parallel. Maybe. So first of all, a first point has to do with music's aesthetic legitimacy, it seems to me, differs historically and even in a contemporary sight from that of other live performing art forms. This point has been percolating implicitly, but I'll be more explicit now. Music's own relation to aesthetic discourse, to the history of aesthetics generally, is different from that of other live performing art forms. As another shorthand, we can recall Walter Pater, an easy shorthand I know, but one that reminds us that music's condition is the one to which all arts aspire. I know we don't really believe that anymore, but the legacy of this kind of thinking arguably still persists and still has its manifestations and influence, and arguably undergirds that the persistence of the notion of absolute music now. It's a legacy that acts in the mode of belief. It means that music does not, say, have to explain itself or defend itself in exactly the same terms as dance, and certainly not as theater. Certainly not as theater. It also means that various critical discourses, certainly 20th century art discourses, but also many that go all the way back to Plato, operate differently as well. Clement Greenberg and Michael Fried modeled their modernist art criticism on music and its medium specificity, using that medium specificity as a kind of north star for thinking about modernist art forms in a visual art world. But meanwhile, theater, that other live performing art form, was the poor stepchild in the argument, condemned for being against aesthetics, condemned to being anti-art, and the thing that we all need to defeat. So I'd love to think that's certainly a different impulse and a different legacy. How about other ways that a musical difference distinguishes the way it performs from the ways other performing arts forms perform? The fact is, here's another obvious difference, is that so much of the live performing art of music is often not live, or often not experienced as live. This is to ask, what difference does it make that music operates in our lives affectively, economically, spatially, sonically, so often as a recording? So yes, dance can be recorded. Yes, theater can be recorded. And yes, Met Live displays cinematic experiences of quasi-live events of opera in theaters. But those exceptions largely prove the rule that music now sits comfortably or uncomfortably, but still ubiquitously in recorded circulation. What difference does this difference make, if any, in these hybrid experiments or thinking about how it functions as a medium? For one, it reinforces a sense that this is the non-optical nature of the event, even if we take pains to attend a live concert, to come here or elsewhere to a concert hall to close our eyes and listen. For another, it invites the question of how frictionlessly and ambiently music seems to mix itself into any cross-arts event. It can be part of a cross-arts experiment without being at its center, and without some receivers even fully recognizing its presence. That ubiquity can, of course, mean several things. It can mean non-recognition, as in we may not even give the music credit for the work that it's doing for us or to us. Certainly that difference also invites reflection on an economic difference, on how an artist makes a living, on how a musical economy operates differently from other arts economies. The copying of the musical form and its circulation, whether on vinyl or CDs or streaming, means that artists associated with that form face slightly different layers of opportunity and exploitation than do choreographers or theater makers. So I'll use this last suggestion about economies to get to a last 10th reflection, which was also one that I have been thinking about for a while in other contexts. That is the relationship between live art and a living wage. The cross-arts experiment landscape exposed then, and does still, the related but different economies at work within artistic disciplines. When dance practitioners around 2010 started to see how much documentation of a performance could yield on an art market, dancers started to sell documentation themselves. Visual artists who never sold tickets sometimes did, but when they did performance, they knew to plan for the resale of its documentation or the residues of the object world. Some theater artists began signing with galleries, not only with agents. Most, we could say, where there's that economy going and the sort of experiment across different arts economies started to occur. But even within that, it had to be said that most of the, say, sophisticated or innovative or avant-garde live performing art forms, even musical ones that might be recorded, relied on a nonprofit or public sector model in order to persist, much more than a for-profit art market. In the United States, the live performing arts have historically been funded by what we call the nonprofit sphere, the philanthropic sphere. And in Europe, as Gritty says, contemporary, here's a quote, contemporary art music relies on structures of funding that invariably relate back to the state, i.e. a public sector model. All of these scrambles bespeak economic precarity, economic distrust, economic hope, but it always re-ups a question about what economic models will sustain cultural workers, art makers of all varieties. And of course, whatever has happened historically across the state, philanthropy, or for-profit worlds, these nonprofit worlds and these public sector worlds are much more, I'm going to bring it up again, imperiled in the actual new now. The authoritarian now that threatens to neoliberalize experiment along with dissent from every aspect of the cultural sector. It is the threat of that development that puts all of my questions, all of my equations, all of my logic problems around the arts into higher relief. It is one that clarifies why it's important to understand each other's genealogies, I think, even if it's also important not to engage with the narcissism of minor differences to such an extent that we keep ourselves from building necessary cross-arts, cross-cultural coalitions. Finally, all art forms have their celebrity artists, distributing opportunities and resources inequitably and sometimes without logic. But sometimes there is a logic, one discernible in the way we talk, the way we make time to talk, about the way we perform now, the way we perform in the new now, the way we might perform later, and yet another new now, and for a future where artists and artistic experiments still live. Thank you.